Good morning. You ready to start Heritage Studies, a brand new chapter? All right, we're going to be talking about rebuilding the nation after the Civil War. We're going to look at three types of people, three groups of people, I guess, who were involved in the rebuilding, or sometimes it's known as the Reconstruction era. You know, if you have a tornado or something come through and destroy some things, then you have to get back out there when it's over and you have to reconstruct and rebuild. Well, that's what happened after the Civil War. So look at your book on page 27. It's the very beginning of chapter 2. At the same time, I'd like for you to have your work text out, page 14 in your work text. I'd like for you to have that out because there's some things on this page that we really need to fill out as we're looking through this section, through this lesson 9. All right, so the title of the chapter is Rebuilding the Nation. Now, look on page 27. You see that timeline. Now, it starts at 1865. That's the end of the Civil War. Remember last week we were talking about the Civil War, the war between the states, it's known as a lot of times, between the North and the South. Now, remember what happened, that some of the southern states, beginning with South Carolina, remember they had decided to secede, not succeed, secede from the Union. And 5 other states followed. Remember, they were like, we're not going to be part of this. We don't want to play with y'all anymore. We're going to be our own group. So they decided to secede from the Union because they felt like the nation, the Union, the government was breaking the constitutional laws that had been set forth for different things. Anyway, so they ended up doing that. Well, that caused a war between the states, and the North won the war, and slavery was ended. Remember, there was an amendment made to the Constitution, and that's what's so great about our Constitution. Our Constitution was written and signed and all that in 1789. That was made the Constitution is what we would call the law of the land here in America. It sets our government in place, and it says what they can and can't do, and it also gives us as citizens a Bill of Rights that tells us what our rights are. And thankfully in America we have so many rights. I've got a daughter who is in Cuba. She left last Wednesday, and she should be back tomorrow, I think, or the next day. Cuba is an island that's south of America. It's south of Florida, and it's a communist country, which means their government has one man or one group that's in control, and they watch everything you do. They're a very poor country, but she went there on a mission trip with our church. So if you don't mind, pray for Lydia. That's my daughter. All right, so let's go ahead and look here where it says looking to the future. Do you see that box there on page 27? All right, so in that box, do you see those 2 black words? One is reconstruction and one is freedmen. Okay, it's one word. Now, look at your page 14 in your work text. Have that right beside you also. Do you see at the top there are 3 terms that we need to define? One is reconstruction and one is freedmen. The other one is industry, so we'll define that when we get to it. So let's look right here and read about looking to the future and see if we can write down a definition for these 2 words. So after the Civil War ended, Americans had to live in a country that was far different from the one 5 years earlier. The period from 1865 to 1877 is called Reconstruction, which means to rebuild. The Reconstruction was both a time period and a process of rebuilding the South and reuniting the nation. During this time, Americans had to rebuild their nation physically, socially, and politically. Even after the fighting from the Civil War stopped, many Americans still didn't feel like one people. The 3 main groups of Americans were freedmen, Southerners, and Northerners. The freedmen were people who used to be slaves but were now free. Many freedmen were joyful and hopeful about freedom. Some were concerned about finding a home or a job. Most freedmen praised God for delivering them from bondage. All right, so let's write down a definition for Reconstruction for this right here. So you can put up on the top of your page, beside Reconstruction, would you put this? The period from... Actually, let me go ahead and put it on the screen and you can copy it. How about that? Okay, so on your page, here's what I'd like for you to put for the definition for Reconstruction. It was the period from 1865, which was right after the Civil War, to 1877, when America was begin. I guess I better fix that, right? It's not begin. It should be being. When America was being rebuilt by reuniting the nation physically, socially, and politically. These three words are pretty important, and you may or may not understand these words, but physically means obviously they had to clean the mess up, rebuild buildings and that kind of stuff. Socially, it means people to people. They were trying to fix how people were feeling. Politically means the government. And then freedmen were people freed from slavery. So go ahead and put that in there. Now there is a third word, industry. And we will go ahead and we will add that word if my computer will let me. Okay, we're going to add this word. This is the other word, industry. And this is what it is. It's the making of things or providing of services for the purpose of making money. So you'll want to put that in there too. Let me go ahead and underline it so we can know what this is. Industry. Woo, I don't want to move the whole thing, do I? There we go. There's our three words we need to know. So make sure and pause it and write all that down. All right. Did you get all those words written down? All right, now keep that close to you because you see the bottom part of that work text page. It says to list some responses of the Northerners, the Southerners, and the freedmen to the Reconstruction. Because remember, there were three different ones that we talked about right here that worked with rebuilding the nation. And as we go, we're going to write some things down. So let's look at page 28 in your book. All right, so I'm going to read this, and as I read, I want you to be listening for Northerners, Southerners, and freedmen and their responses to this cleanup and this rebuilding. At the end of the Civil War, most Southerners were hurt and confused. Invading armies had destroyed their states. Many men had died in battle or of disease. Without slavery, many Southerners were concerned about who would work in the fields. The war had brought peace, but Southerners didn't feel that the war had helped them. It only left them with new problems. Northerners celebrated the war's end. They had accomplished their goals. The Union, or the states that had remained in the United States, stayed together and slavery ended. Although many Northern soldiers had died, their deaths were not in vain. Northerners looked forward to a better future. Everyone hoped Reconstruction would form America into a better nation. However, they didn't agree on exactly what a better America was. Let's look at page 29 where it says the Reconstruction begins, and there's a picture down there at the bottom. And this is Carey Street in Richmond, Virginia. That was a picture taken after the war. Now do you see how and why they had to clean up even physically? Yeah, there was a whole lot there. Let's look at the top of page 29. Now, we're still listening to their responses to. Now, here's a couple we could add. On the Northerners, remember, how did they feel about the end of the war? They celebrated. So you might want to put underneath Northerners, they celebrated the end of the war. Pause this while you write that in there. Okay, and also, what about Northerners? What we read in there about Northerners? They not only did they celebrate, but they looked forward to a better future. Remember, they said their men didn't die in vain for no reason. They looked forward to a better future. So pause it while you write that in there underneath Northerners. Looked for a better future. Okay, anything else you can think of about the Northerners? They hoped Reconstruction would form America into a better nation. You can just put, they wanted America to be better. So put that underneath Northerners. Okay, what about Southerners? How did they feel about the end of the war? They were hurt and confused. Write that down underneath Southerners. What else were the Southerners, what were they concerned about? Who was going to work in the fields? Because slavery was gone now. So they were concerned, who's going to work in the fields? Write that underneath Southerners. All right, let's look at page 29, and it's going to tell us a little bit about freedmen and how they felt about the war. Freedmen began to enjoy life as free people. Some left their plantations, looked for family, looked for work. When the freedmen had been slaves, they couldn't leave their plantations without a written pass. Now the freedmen could go anywhere they wanted to. Freedmen realized that to enjoy their freedom, they needed to work. They hoped to be repaid for the many years they had worked as slaves. Most freedmen wanted land so they could raise their own food. They didn't want to work for someone else. Southerners hoped to rebuild the South as it had been before the war. Although Northern armies had destroyed Southern cities, bridges, and railroads, Southern culture remained. Southerners planned to reopen their schools and colleges. They also wanted to rebuild their plantations and cities. And even though slavery had ended, many Southerners still wanted to direct the freedmen's work. Turn the page. We'll finish filling this page out on our work text as soon as we finish our reading section. Look at page 30. There's a picture up there. It looks like New York. The war had very little effect. There was not a lot of stuff fought up in that section of the United States. Most Northerners felt pleased. Their state suffered little physical damage from the war. Factories kept running. Immigrants had arrived during the war. The number of people in the North continued to grow. Many in the North hoped to help the freedmen make new lives. Many Northerners wanted to change the way the Southerners treated freedmen. Northerners also wanted to change Southern industry. There's our word that we've already defined. Industry is the making of things or providing of services for the purpose of making money. Some industries get materials to sell to people or factories. Some industries manufacture goods. Other industries provide services like education. The Northerners, Southerners, and freedmen each had their own hopes and plans for Reconstruction. Not all these goals could be met. Southerners wanted life to return to what it was like before the war. This would stop the changes the freedmen wanted. Northerners wanted to make the South more like the North, but changing the South might destroy the old Southern culture. Most freedmen wanted freedom to control their own work, their own families, their own social groups. Few Northerners and Southerners thought the freedmen could care for themselves. During the Reconstruction, each of these groups tried to change the country. Each group succeeded in some ways, but none of the groups succeeded in everything. So the three groups that wanted to change America during the Reconstruction were the Northerners, the Southerners, and the freedmen. And they all had their own ideas. They all had their own thoughts. They all had their own likes and dislikes about different things. Now, there is something in here that I'm not real fond of, the way that it says, back up on the kind of in the middle part of 30. It kind of gives where it says many Northerners wanted to change the way Southerners treated freedmen. I'm not sure I agree with that statement because in so many things that we read, other than this, when you read about that time in history, that kind of suggests that Northerners treated freedmen well and Southerners treated them poorly. And that's not true. Maybe the majority, but that's not all the way true. Northerners also did not treat freedmen very well. They segregated them, and we'll learn a little bit about segregation later on in this chapter, but they had them working and staying and living and going to church in different places. In fact, even when they went to church, they couldn't sit with white people, and in fact, a lot of times they couldn't even go to the white person's church. They had to go to a different church. But again, we'll talk about that later on. But don't fall into that where you think that just the North was good to the slaves or the freedmen and the South was bad to them, because that's not all the way true. The South was also good to the freedmen and to the blacks as well. Okay, so let's finish this page right here. So the freedmen, how did they feel about the war? They were so happy. They were joyful. They had freedom. Write that down under freedmen. They were joyful about freedom. What about finding a home or a job? They needed a home and a job. Write that down. The freedmen praised God for their freedom. The freedmen wanted a better nation. They wanted America to become better. The freedmen also realized that they had to work. The freedmen also hoped that they would be repaid for their years as a slave. The freedmen also wanted to control their life. Look back over at the Northerners. They wanted to change. Remember, they wanted to change how the Southerners treated the freedmen. That's what this says in here, but I'm not so sure I want you to put that on there. Let's skip that. The North did want to change the way the South treated the freedmen, but at the same time, the North did not treat them that well. So we're not going to put that in there. I don't agree with that statement. Now, if you agree with that statement, you can put that in there. You can think how you want to think. Now, the Northerners were thankful they had very little damage. Write that underneath Northerners. They had very little damage. The Northerners wanted to change Southern industry. The Northerners also wanted to make the South more like the North. Let's look at the Southerners. Let's finish filling out just a couple of things, how they felt about it. So they were hurt and confused over the war. They were concerned who was going to work in the fields. They felt that the war didn't help them. So you put that underneath Southerners. Felt the war didn't help them. The Southerners wanted America to be a better nation. So they all three had that in common. They all wanted America to become a better nation. Put that under Southerners as well. The Southerners wanted to go back to the way things were. Okay. Hope you got some of those notes in there. That'll just kind of help you through the chapter. And I don't have to see that page, but I do, for your assignment, would like for you to do the crossword puzzle on page 13. And please use your book to find the answers, okay? Now, you might even have to go back into chapter 1 to do some of these, okay? If you need help, let me know. But I'm probably going to grade page 13. That's all for today.